My name is Seraphine Laughton, and I turned 70 last spring. I've lived in Asheville nearly all my life, long enough to know every turn of its misty hills and every creak of my own bones. People say I'm steady. The kind of woman who keeps receipts and remembers anniversaries no one else does. Maybe that's true. I like things in order. So when something slips out of rhythm, I notice. That morning felt wrong from the start. The air was heavy, pressed low against the Blue Ridge, and the radio crackled with storm warnings. I had an appointment with Dr. Rowan Hale, the man who'd been my physician for over 20 years. He treated my late husband, Richard, through his final illness and once told me that grief was just love with nowhere to go. I trusted him. That's why the tremor in his hand unsettled me so deeply. He asked routine questions, but his voice carried an edge I'd never heard before. Too careful, too practiced. When he listened to my chest, his stethoscope slipped. "You're healthy as ever, Seraphine," he said. But the words came out flat, almost frightened. His eyes flicked toward the hallway twice in less than a minute. When I stood to leave, he followed me to the door. "Take care of yourself," he murmured. Reaching for my hand as if in habit, I felt something smooth slide into my palm, a folded slip of paper. I didn't realize what it was until I was already outside, the clinic's glass doors reflecting the darkening sky. Sitting on the concrete curb beside my car, I opened it. 5 words, written in a hurried, slanted scrawl. "Don't go home. Run." For a moment, I could only stare at it. The traffic hummed. Someone laughed in the parking lot. A life continued around me that no longer felt like mine. My heart wasn't racing yet. It had gone very still, like a deer listening for a hunter's breath. I refolded the note and slipped it into my jacket pocket. Then I started the car, steering toward the road that led back to my quiet house on Ashwood Lane, where the porch light was always left on for me. By the time I turned onto Ashwood Lane, the sun had slipped behind the ridge, leaving the street soaked in amber light. My house looked the same as always: white shutters, garden neat, wind chime moving in the quiet air. But stepping inside felt different. The stillness had weight, as if the walls were holding their breath. Corvin was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, chopping herbs with exaggerated cheer. "Mom, you're back early," he said. His voice was bright, too bright. Lyra appeared behind him, all perfume and smiles that didn't reach her eyes. "We were just talking about dinner. Thought we'd make something light for you." Their daughter, Livia, peeked from the hallway, her face pale beneath her dyed hair. "Hi, Grandma," she murmured, and disappeared upstairs before I could answer. I hung my coat, feeling the paper still folded in its pocket. Dr. Hale's handwriting burned behind my ribs. I told myself I was being foolish, that age was making me suspicious. But the kitchen smelled faintly of gas. The stove left half on. Lyra laughed when I pointed it out. "Oh, that silly thing again. I must have brushed it by accident." Later, when I went to fetch my reading glasses, they weren't on the side table where I always left them. Corvin found them an hour later on the porch railing. "You probably set them down while watering the plants," he said kindly, the way someone speaks to a child. Mail lay opened on my desk, bank statements, envelopes torn cleanly across. No one admitted touching them. By nightfall, a thin unease settled over me like a second skin. I locked my bedroom door for the first time in years. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the sound of voices. Faint, deliberate whispers from beyond the hall. Lyra's low murmur. Corvin's sharper tone. A pause. Then the soft creak of the floorboards outside my door. I lay perfectly still, holding my breath until the silence folded back over the house. The note in my jacket seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. "Don't go home. Run." Sleep never came. I lay in the dark, listening to the house breathe, pipes ticking, the clock thudding softly from the hall. Every sound felt deliberate. A code I couldn't quite read. Around 2 a.m, faint voices threaded through the floorboards. At first I thought it was the television, but then I heard Lyra's voice, sharp and measured. The doctor didn't sign it. Without that report, we can't file anything, Corvin answered. His tone low, tired. He said she's perfectly fine. I told him he must have missed the signs. There was a silence. Then Lyra again, colder this time. Then we'll find another one. Someone who isn't sentimental. We just need the paperwork. Once she's declared incompetent, everything transfers legally. My throat tightened. Declared incompetent. The phrase settled like ice in my stomach. Then Livia spoke, her voice trembling. Mom, I don't think we should be doing this. Grandma's not crazy. She just forgets stuff sometimes. Lyra's reply came like a slap in the dark. Don't start that again. This is for her own good and ours. You want to go to college, don't you? I pressed my hand over my mouth. The air felt thin, every breath scraping my chest. That was when it clicked, Dr. Hale's hand shaking, his eyes darting toward the hall. He hadn't been afraid of me. He'd been afraid for me. He knew what they were planning and refused to take part. The note wasn't a mistake. It was a warning. I fumbled for my phone on the nightstand and slid my thumb across the recorder icon. The screen's faint glow lit the trembling of my fingers as their voices continued below, discussing symptoms, care homes, and signatures. I captured a few seconds before I killed the light and lay still again. By dawn, pale light pushed through the curtains, turning the dust in the air to silver. I sat up slowly, the phone heavy in my hand. The recording was short, but enough. I'd heard enough. I rose, opened the closet, and reached for my old leather suitcase. The first light was just beginning to thin the dark when I opened the old cedar chest at the foot of my bed. Inside lay decades of my life photographs, travel souvenirs, and a small flash drive tucked inside a velvet pouch. Richard once called it our safety key, though he never explained what he meant. I slipped it into my coat pocket without thinking, only knowing I might never come back. I packed what I could carry quietly: passport, spare bank card, a few bills from the drawer where I kept grocery money. The floorboards creaked under my feet, each sound slicing through the silence. I moved like someone walking through a stranger's home. When I reached the front door, the porch light flickered against the dawn. The air outside smelled of wet leaves and wood smoke. I walked 2 blocks before calling a cab, giving the driver the name Seraphine Elor, my maiden name. Forgotten by most except the bank. My voice sounded steady, almost rehearsed. By the time we reached downtown Asheville, the sun had risen over the ridge, spilling gold across the storefronts. I asked the driver to drop me near a narrow brick inn wedged between a cafe and an antique shop. It looked small enough to disappear inside. The receptionist didn't ask questions. I signed the register, paid cash, and asked for a room overlooking the alley. When the door closed behind me, I finally exhaled. The quiet felt earned, down the block. An old payphone still clung to a wall outside a laundromat. I fed in coins and dialed Dr. Hale's office number from memory. His voice was low, strained. Seraphine, thank God. Are you safe? Safe enough, I said. Tell me the truth. He hesitated. Your son and his wife came to see me last week. They wanted me to write that you were showing early dementia. When I refused, they offered money. That's why I gave you the note. The metal receiver felt cold against my ear. You have to get proof, he added softly. I will, I said, my voice steady now. I promise you, I will. The morning after I spoke with Dr. Hale, I found myself sitting in a narrow office on Biltmore Avenue, a brass plaque on the door reading Callista Wren, attorney at law, elder protection, and estate advocacy. Callista was in her 40s, composed and sharp-eyed, her hair pinned neatly behind one ear. She listened without interrupting as I told her everything: Dr. Hale's note, the whispers in the night, the forged diagnosis. When I finished, she leaned forward. "Mrs. Laughton, what your family is attempting falls under financial and psychological abuse. If we move quickly, we can protect your assets before they file anything." Her voice carried that quiet confidence that makes you believe rules can still hold back evil. She called in a man named Orrin Vale, a private investigator with a gray beard and eyes that seemed to catch everything. He nodded at me politely. "If they've left a trail, I'll find it." By that afternoon, Orrin had already begun tracing digital records through legal channels. He returned 2 days later with a folder so thick it barely closed. Inside were bank forms with signatures that weren't mine, authorization letters printed on my letterhead, and a guardianship petition drafted but not yet filed. My name appeared again and again beside words like incompetent and protective custody. Callista read in silence, her finger tracing the fake signature. "They moved fast," she said, "but not faster than the law." She began preparing a motion for a temporary protection order, citing elder abuse statutes specific to North Carolina. It would freeze any transfers until the matter was reviewed by a judge. Orrin looked up from another sheet. "They also opened 2 credit cards under your name," he said softly. "Nearly $8,000 spent in the last month." For a moment, humiliation burned through me, sharp and small, like a paper cut. Then it hardened into something else. I wasn't frightened anymore. I felt the calm that comes when anger finally finds its purpose. "They thought I wouldn't notice," I said, closing the folder. "Let's make sure they do." 3 days after Callista filed the motion, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. The voice on the other end was small, trembling. "Grandma? It's me." It took me a moment to recognize Livia. I hadn't heard her sound like a child in years. She was calling from school, whispering between sobs. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she said. "Dad said it was just paperwork, something to protect you. But now Mom's talking about selling the house. They said you'd forget soon, and it wouldn't matter." I closed my eyes, steadying my voice. "It matters, darling, and it's not too late to do what's right." She hesitated. "I don't want them to know I called. I won't say a word, I promised. But I need your help. Anything on your father's computer documents, emails, whatever you can find." That evening, an email arrived under the subject line, "Don't open at home." Attached were screenshots of forged medical forms, timestamps, and a draft of a false dementia evaluation. Dr. Hale's name typed beneath a signature that wasn't his. When I showed them to Callista, she nodded grimly. "This is powerful, but we'll need to authenticate it. If we use evidence obtained from a family member without proper context, they'll claim manipulation." Orrin stepped in, setting his briefcase on the table. "I can get us a court-approved surveillance order. Once she's back in the house, we can legally record everything said or done regarding those documents." The room fell silent. Callista's eyes found mine. "That means going home. Seraphine, are you ready for that?" I looked out the window toward the mountains, the sky turning violet over Asheville's rooftops. Fear had been my first language these past weeks. But beneath it now was something steadier, resolve, clean and sharp. They taught me to doubt myself. I said quietly, "Now I'll make them believe me." Callista folded her hands. "Then we begin." That night, I packed again, this time without shaking. I would return to Ashwood Lane not as prey, but as witness. 2 weeks later, I was back on Ashwood Lane. The house looked exactly as I'd left it. Porch swept, curtains drawn, the same potted fern by the door. Corvin met me in the driveway, surprise flickering across his face before he replaced it with concern. "Mom, you should have told us you were coming home," he said, ushering me inside as though I were fragile glass. Lyra greeted me with exaggerated warmth. "We were so worried about you," she said, her hand brushing my arm for just a moment too long. "But it's good you're back. Familiar spaces will help your memory." I smiled faintly, pretending not to notice the word's sharp edge. That evening, when I couldn't find my reading glasses, I found them in the refrigerator. I repeated questions, misplaced keys, even called the dog by the wrong name, small rehearsed acts that made Lyra exchange knowing looks with Corvin. When they left for errands, Orrin Vale arrived through the back gate, a small toolbox in hand. He worked quickly, fitting a pinhole camera into the face of the kitchen clock and another behind the bookshelf in the den. "They won't notice a thing," he murmured. "Callista's team will monitor the feed." I watched his careful hands, thinking how strange it was to rely on strangers for truth. By the next afternoon, Corvin announced a new appointment. "Dr. Marin's coming tomorrow. A psychiatrist. Just a quick evaluation, nothing to worry about." His smile didn't reach his eyes. I nodded, feigning confusion. "Of course, dear, if it helps." That night, as the house settled into quiet, I heard voices again, softer now, conspiratorial. Lyra's whisper drifted up through the floor. "Once she signs the papers, the realtor's ready. We'll have buyers lined up within the week," Corvin answered, weary but certain. "Just hold it together until the evaluation, then it's done." I sat at the top of the stairs, the faint blue light from the hallway glinting off the brass banister. Every muscle in my body was taut, my breath held in measured silence. I touched the folded note still hidden in my pocket and whispered to the darkness, "Not yet." The afternoon light slanted through the living room windows, warm and harmless. On the coffee table lay a folder of papers that Corvin had placed there himself, power of attorney, neatly tabbed with yellow flags for where I should sign. He stood beside me, voice soft as if coaxing a child. "This will make everything easier. Mom, you won't have to worry about bills or doctors anymore." Lyra hovered by the doorway, her smile brittle under its practiced sympathy. "Just a signature," she said, "for your own comfort." I adjusted my glasses, hands steady despite the tremor running beneath my skin. "Of course," I murmured. "You've both done so much for me. It's time I returned the favor." Corvin handed me a pen. The room was silent, except for the slow tick of the kitchen clock, Orrin's camera hidden behind its face. I lowered the pen toward the line, then paused. A sharp knock echoed through the house. Corvin frowned. "Were you expecting someone?" Before I could answer, the door opened and Callista Wren stepped inside, crisp and composed, followed by Orrin and 2 uniformed officers. "Good afternoon," she said evenly. "Mr. and Mrs. Laughton, this is a court-issued warrant authorizing seizure of all financial documents and electronic devices related to Mrs. Laughton's estate." Lyra's face drained of color. "This is ridiculous." Callista lifted a small remote. A moment later, the television screen flickered to life, filling the room with familiar voices, their voices. Lyra's "Once she signs the papers, the house is ours." Corvin's "Keep her confused until it's done." The sound filled every corner, stripping the air of pretense. Corvin's knees buckled. He sank into a chair, staring at nothing. Lyra clutched the armrest, shaking her head in denial. "Those recordings are fake. She's not well." She stopped. I said quietly, "You taught me to doubt myself." But I remembered everything. Outside, sirens wailed faintly, growing closer. Callista's eyes met mine, a small nod, steady and sure. For the first time in weeks, the house didn't feel like a trap. It felt like truth, finally breathing. The following morning, The house was crowded with quiet footsteps and murmured voices. Officers moved carefully through each room, photographing papers, boxing up folders, logging every piece of evidence. I sat at the dining table, a cup of tea cooling between my hands. The air smelled faintly of dust and lemon polish, like something being reset after a long neglect. One of the officers paused beside the grand piano in the corner. It had belonged to Richard. He played on Sunday mornings when the world still felt kind. The officer held up a small flash drive sealed in a plastic bag. "Ma'am, we found this in your desk. There's a note taped to it says, 'Press lowest C.' Does that mean anything to you?" The words drew the air from my lungs. I stood slowly, crossing the room. The piano's lid creaked as I lifted it. My fingers hovered over the keys, trembling only once before pressing the lowest C. A soft click echoed inside the frame. Beneath the keyboard, a narrow panel shifted loose. The officer helped me pull it open, revealing a small envelope wrapped in wax paper, yellowed around the edges. On its front, in Richard's careful handwriting, were the words, "For Seraphine, if ever trust is tested." Inside lay a notarized document, the Laughton Living Trust, dated 7 years before his death. Every property, account, and share was secured under my name, with explicit clauses preventing transfer without my written consent. Callista read it twice, eyes widening. "Seraphine, this changes everything. Legally, they never owned a single brick." I couldn't speak. My knees gave a little, and the officer steadied me as I sat back down. Tears blurred the black ink until it shimmered like water. Richard had known. Somehow, he had seen the storm before it arrived and built me a shelter made of paper and love. I pressed the envelope to my chest, breathing in the faint scent of cedar. I wasn't crying for what I'd lost anymore, but for what had been saved long before I realized I needed saving. Spring settled softly over Asheville, carrying the scent of magnolia through the open windows. My garden bloomed again. Lavender, tulips, and the small patch of mint Richard had once tended with quiet devotion. The world outside seemed lighter, as if winter had lifted more than just its season. It had been 6 months since the trial. Corvin and Lyra were serving their sentences, their names sealed away in court records. I no longer had the energy to read. Livia lived with me now. Therapy made her gentler, quieter, the way sunlight softens after rain. We spoke little about what happened. Sometimes she helped me prune the roses. Sometimes we just sat on the porch steps, drinking tea in silence, healing. I'd learned, made its own music. That afternoon, I set out a small table by the window and poured tea for Dr. Rowan Hale and Callista Wren. Rowan looked older, the strain of those weeks still etched around his eyes, but his voice carried peace again. "You did what most people couldn't," he said softly. Callista smiled, setting down her cup. "You didn't just win a case, Seraphine. You set a precedent." I looked toward the front door, where a new brass hook hung beside the frame. It gleamed in the light, engraved with a single word, "Home." 2 keys dangled from it, one marked mine, the other guessed. When the conversation faded into gentle laughter, I walked over and touched the cool metal, feeling its weight, its honesty. For the first time in years, the house didn't echo. It breathed. Love had built these walls through years of work, of care, of mistakes and repair. But it was the boundaries, finally drawn and held, that kept them standing. Outside, the wind carried the sound of church bells from downtown. Mingling with the steady rustle of spring leaves, I closed the door gently, the brass hook catching the light, and felt the quiet truth settle deep within me. Peace doesn't mean forgetting. It means returning, but on your own terms.